As ROK President Moon Jae-in's China visit wraps up, are the two countries getting closer back to each other, providing greater opportunity for the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue to be resolved? And at the WTO ministerial conference this week in Buenos Aires, the US, the EU and Japan signed a statement to fight so-called unfair trade practices. Are they pointing a finger at China, and how valid are these accusations? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. The Republic of Korea is firmly committed to resolving the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue through peaceful means and is willing to work with China to safeguard peace and stability in the region. ROK President Moon Jae-in said this during his 4-day visit to China. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping also reiterated that we must unswervingly uphold the goal of a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula and never allow war or chaos. As both countries share a common interest in preventing conflict, how will improved relations help resolve the crisis? Meanwhile, Moon's visit comes on the heels of U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's suggestion that the U.S. could start negotiation talks with the DPRK without preconditions, only to be changed 1 day later when the White House and State Department both said no, the U.S. is not ready to begin talks without preconditions. What's behind this contradiction? Joining me for the discussion on the topic are Shung-Li Lee, Director of International Politics Department at the University of International Business and Economics, and Professor Ben Schaefer, a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Shung, now this is the second time that both leaders have expressed the willingness to work together for a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. Last time was during the sidelines of the APEC meeting. Did China and ROK reach any concrete agreements as to what to do next?
It is still too early to say the two sides can reach some concrete agreements. But this visit by President Moon to Beijing may be a very significant step to restore the bilateral relations, which has been hurt by deployment of SAR system in South Korea in the past few months. And by this visit, there may be a very good new start for the bilateral relations between the two countries. And as we all know, in the past few months, around the deployment of the SAR system in South Korea, around the nuclear issue of DPRK, all these factors has some negative influence on bilateral relations between China and South Korea. Now, by our joint efforts to restore the bilateral relations and our cooperation, our consensus on nuclear issue of DPRK may be some positive factor in bilateral relations. And if we can have more cooperation, if we can have more consensus, and our joint efforts on nuclear issue of DPRK may be very helpful for enhancement of bilateral relations between the two countries in the future. All in all, this may be a very good start, not only on nuclear issue of DPRK, but also on the peace in this region.
Professor Schaefer, how do you look at the potential impact of President Moon Jae-in's visit to China on the situation on the Korean Peninsula?
It's a very encouraging sign that China and South Korea apparently have patched up some of the major problems they had after the deployment of the missile system. I think it's actually offering us a perspective, giving the upcoming Olympics in PyeongChang in South Korea. If this would show a further improvement in Chinese-South Korean relations by, let's say, having major Chinese tourist delegations and maybe even the government delegation attending and highlighting the entire event, it would show that China and the Republic of Korea are willing to cooperate together to defuse the situation. And if North Korea might even be willing to engage in some dialogue with South Korea regarding the Olympics, and maybe even having some joint efforts with regard to sports teams and sports events in in the Olympics.
Professor Schaefer, you mentioned the Winter Olympics in PyeongChang. It's interesting that the Financial Times also reported that the ROK has asked the U.S. to delay their joint military exercises with the ROK until after these Winter Olympics. What is the significance of this proposal? Will it open up the possibility of the two sides using this event as a kind of a window of opportunity to explore further possibilities of negotiations?
Yeah, absolutely. It opens a window of opportunity. I mean, of course, we don't know whether anybody will take the opportunity, but it's a very smart move on the side of the South Korean government to ask for a delay of joint military exercises because they want to have a completely incident and conflict-free Olympics and a lot of international visitors coming to Korea for the Olympics. So yes, it's a window of opportunity, and we will see whether one of those sides or maybe two of those sides will actually take this opportunity.
I know you don't like to speculate on things, but I'm going to ask you, what are the chances of the United States agreeing to that proposal of delaying these joint exercises, which have been going on for decades?
Well, there are joint exercises, so for joint exercises you need both sides, and if one side asked for a delay, it's hard to imagine that the other side would insist on holding them nonetheless. I think it's a significant move, and I don't think we will see a conflict here between the Republic of Korea and the United States. If the Republic of Korea has expressed this wish, then probably the United States would follow suit, especially for those Winter Olympics months.
Well, it is interesting because China has for quite a while been proposing this idea of this double suspension, which means on the one side the ROK and the United States suspend their joint military exercises, and on the other hand the DPRK suspend their nuclear and missile tests. Mr. Cheong, while the ROK and at least the ROK has shown the readiness and the willingness to suspend these joint military exercises, does it look like the DPRK might also follow suit to at least hold themselves back, at least during these Winter Olympic Games?
And for DPRK, maybe it will hope Seoul can somewhat stay away from Washington, D.C. But United States will always be cornerstone of DPRK's national security policy. And now the Winter Olympics may be also important for Seoul. And this may test DPRK's sincerity towards its southern neighbor. That means if DPRK can suspend its missile test and nuclear test, it may send a very active signal to international community, especially to South Korea, that DPRK has at least some sincerity to keep some peace on the peninsula. And the Winter Olympics in South Korea may be a good opportunity to test this sincerity of DPRK.
Yeah, at least till now, during the 4 days of President Moon Jae-in's visit to China, there has not been any negative action on the side of the DPRK. But according to our correspondent in Pyongyang, the DPRK seems to expect Seoul to stay away from the United States. Mr. Cheong, do you think that is possible? What dilemma is Seoul faced with at this moment?
Just as I just have said, the Seoul-Washington relations alliance has always been cornerstone of Seoul's national security, and that means in predictable future, Seoul will still maintain the alliance with United States. However, for Mr. Moon's administration, the better choice for Seoul maybe keep some balance, more balanced diplomacy with among all the major countries such as China, Russia, and the United States. That means South Korea, U.S. allies may not have a great change. However, there may be more cooperation, more coordination between Seoul and Beijing, Seoul and Moscow, and that may be a choice for Seoul. And for DPRK, although, of course, it hopes Seoul can somewhat stay away from the United States, but I think that's not the key point. The key point may be DPRK can stop its nuclear test and missile test. That may be the key point for the peace on the peninsula.
Right. Professor Schaefer, let me ask you about the contradiction that we have seen most recently between Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and the U.S. White House and the State Department about whether there should be preconditions to start negotiating with the DPRK. What does that say? Is that just another case of self-contradiction that we have been witnessing within this administration, or has there been a message that this administration wants to send out?
That's very interesting what's going on here. Certainly we do not have an administration speaking with one voice in this case, but this is the second time actually that Secretary of State Tillerson came up with a proposal which later was sort of taken back by the White House. But apparently he has the firm belief that something has to be done in terms of negotiations, and now we will have the opportunity today to watch him present his positions, or the positions of the United States government actually, at the United Nations, and there we will actually see how far he will actually be able to go with regard to negotiations, whether he will talk about this, whether he will mention the term, and in what context he will talk about negotiations. So this will be something really interesting to watch today when Secretary of State Tillerson will give his presentation at the United Nations.
Absolutely, and it is reported that the DPRK's ambassador to the United Nations will also be attending that meeting. So very interesting period of time. We'll all be keeping a close watch on the situation. Many thanks to our two guests, Xiongli Li, Director of International Politics Department at the University of International Business and Economics, and Professor Ben Schaefer, Global Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And here is my first point. The Chinese State Council has just announced the decision to set up 3 China ROK industrial parks in 3 cities in North and South China as one of the concrete achievements from President Moon Jae-in's visit to China. It can be said that relations between the two countries are expected to keep warming up in the near future, and this development can positively affect the DPRK's nuclear issue, as both countries are neighbors to the DPRK and have insisted on a peaceful solution to the crisis. Although it is still too early to discuss any prospect for talks, the unified stance of China and the ROK is a much-needed voice of predictable rationality against the self-contradictions of the U.S., coupled with mounting military pressure and reckless rhetoric. You're watching The Point. I'll be back right after this short break. In a joint statement, the European Union, Japan and the United States declare to strengthen their commitment to ensure a global level playing field. Without naming China or any other country, the statement addressed critical concerns of, among other things, unfair competitive conditions caused by market-distorting practices. Now, the declaration came as representatives from around the world met on the sidelines of the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference on Tuesday in Buenos Aires, Argentina this week. Now, the meeting ended with no breakthroughs on key issues. With the U.S. attacking the WTO, why have these economies joined forces to target any third country at this particular moment? Are they talking about China, and what could possibly be behind this move? Do such accusations hold water? I'm joined in the studio by Professor Lu Xianquan, Associate Professor at the University of International Business and Economics of China, and Ina Tangen, author, columnist and commentator. But before we go into the discussion, let's first listen to the spokesperson of China's Ministry of Commerce, who said that China strongly opposes some developed countries jointly placing pressure on developing countries over trade issues.
We oppose the behavior of some developed countries joining hands to pressure developing countries. We always believe that the disputes between countries in international trade areas can be resolved effectively through bilateral dialogue and consultation.
Right, so China says conflicts need to be resolved through consultation instead of any finger pointing or, via insinuation. But first of all, why did Japan, the EU, and the United States come up with this joint statement at this moment, and who are they talking about? Professor Liu?
Well, I think I would rather say that what are they talking about, because they use the word that has been long used by the WTO and member states, the so-called unfair competitive conditions caused by the market distorting practices. And there are a lot of things in the WTO that are under discussion or negotiation.
For instance?
For instance, agriculture, and which is, of course, a central element of the WTO Doha negotiations. And then the so-called embargoes, subsidies to the agriculture industry, actually mainly used by the three countries, Japan.
Three economies.
Yeah, economies, Japan, EU, and the US are being kind of at the center of the negotiation, and asked a lot by developing countries to remove that, and which is, of course, an undone job. So I think that there are a lot of things that are behind this, which we need to look at more comprehensively, instead of just talking about one country or a few countries or one industry.
Yeah. Aina, what is your take on such a joint statement?
Well, you're seeing a very sharp divide between the emerging country, China, and the developed countries. I mean, the sharp contrast that's being drawn between those who made the rules and now complaining about the rules that they made because they were not successful at getting exactly what they want. I mean, we're talking about going back to 1991 when the world economy was at 50 trillion. Now it's at 100 and whatever, 16, 20 trillion. And what happened is, you know, there was a lot of economic development, but part of that is in the metrics itself. I mean, quite frankly, if you look at the profits that were garnered by Europe, Japan, the United States, versus the total economic growth, you'd see that it was completely unbalanced towards the developed countries. But they're now saying that with the actual growth is the measure of this. And I think part of that is this GDP. GDP is not a good measure. It's not a good metric. When you have something like an Apple phone, which is made in China, and it's attributed to China at $1,000 US per unit, when the fact is that the profit and the actual added value within China is less than 1/10 of that. But yet, it is attributed to that. So one of the problems is post-World War II, post-Cold War, you have these metrics that are being used that are no longer valid.
Right. Well, another thing is, it is interesting that they didn't name anybody, right? They just said against any third country. Why is that?
No, I would say probably...
Should China be reacting to this?
Well, I would say probably Chinese are too difficult word for them to pronounce. No, more seriously, I think that, as I said, I would rather believe that they are targeting issues, not countries, because, as I said, not only those countries are subsidizing their agriculture, there are other countries who are also subsidizing their industries, other industries, including some developing ones. And that's why actually in the WTO there are quite a few dispute cases which are related to all these countries we are talking about. And the name behind them is always about the local content subsidies, market distorting practice of all kinds.
So how do they have the audacity to come out and accuse any other third economy for doing what they have been doing too, partly at least?
It's self-interest. I mean, unfortunately today we've gotten further and further away from ideology, and it's become a kind of dog-eat-dog kind of world. So these countries, I mean, Japan is my guess is that they were the ones who said, no, we don't want to name China, because they have upcoming talks the next year. Abe wants to come to China, things like
what
this.
What is the point of coming up with such a non-biting statement while implying that they're talking about China? What do they try to do?
I mean, look at the moment and the place it is happening. I mean, because we're talking on Buenos Aires, where the MC11, Ministerial Conference 11 is going on, and the international community is expecting the big guys, the big economies, including these three and China, India, others, to really make efforts to push for successful outcome, which didn't happen, very little. And then but at the same time, countries just cherry-picking some of the things, like Anna said, of their own interests and trying to highlight that thing. I think there are a lot of things happening behind this which is not going into the right direction, and that's a danger for the system and also for other countries.
Right, and also it is reported that it's Japan who approached the United States, the EU, to come up with such a joint statement, and the reason behind that is potentially the kind of worry that the United States might be taking unilateral action against China. So the EU and Japan thinking we need to take at least trilateral action, if not multilateral action. Aina, if this is true, how would you react?
This is the problem, that people aren't willing to say what the issue is. I mean, Japan is trying to play both sides. From a security point of view and an economic point of view, they want to side the U.S. because they're afraid. I mean, there's a lot of tensions between Japan, China, South Korea, all the places that go back to the Second World War. And there's this kind of passive-aggressive attitude. Japan was pushing for this, but they wouldn't name China. Why? I mean, this is a very odd type of thing. Everyone knows exactly who they're talking about, but they won't mention it. And this is what I characterize as, what we said, passive-aggressive.
Another thing is, it's a very interesting moment, as it is no secret that the Trump administration is very negative about, or President Trump himself is very negative about the WTO. He wants to even withdraw from the WTO. So while you're cursing this organization, then you're teaming up with your fellow members from this organization to come up with such a statement to talk about taking possible action under the WTO framework. I find it ironic.
Well, it's hard to say where they are going. I mean, as you said, that a lot of things are said by Trump and his administration, but a lot of things are happening but not are happening. U.S. has not quit the WTO yet. And then, of course, people say that he prefers bilaterals, but actually he's overturning a lot of bilateral NAFTA and others, trying to renegotiate them. So it's hard to see where he's going and where the administration is going. That's a kind of uncertainty that for very dangerous for a lot of countries. But the problem is that for the system, that kills a lot of things, because without knowing exactly one of the biggest guy is trying to do in the system and which direction it's going, and nobody knows how to move things forward.
Right. Actually, there's one expert who is reported to have been jokingly said, for 70 years you've had a captain of a football team who suddenly doesn't even come to the practice. So players are looking around and saying, now what do we do? So with the captain not there during the practices, where's the WTO going? Where's the multilateral trading regime going? Aina, your take on the situation?
Well, quite frankly, the only thing that's happening on an international basis is China and the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, there's no substantive movement. The U.S. has pulled out of TTIP, TTP. I mean, it's all gone. Paris Climate Accord, you name it. Trump has decided that the U.S. will put America first, but I don't know what that means, because America first means we are a trading entity. We have over $2 trillion worth of exports, and this is the baffling thing. He's putting those in danger. Even though the global economy has been rising for quite some time, it's baffling exactly what he hopes to achieve. He seems to be kind of taking this kind of Pyrrhic victory. He wants to make points with his base, the Jerusalem, and no one understands this. And this is the really troubling part. You cannot do business or politics unless you have certainty or predictability. And Trump has removed that from the United States.
So with this big picture, what is the future of the WTO looking like? Professor Liu, you are based in Switzerland. Your observation, what's the mood there?
I mean, coming back to your example as a kind of captain is not there anymore. I mean, what WTO is doing that, like a game, no game will stop simply because captain is not there. The game will go on, but in a different way. And what is happening in WTO is, as what has happened in Buenos Aires, is that things are still moving forward, maybe too slowly. But still they managed to achieve one agreement on fishery subsidies. There are a few plurilaterals going on. So this is going to be a kind of movement for the WTO in the future. But more seriously is that how to manage the whole situation without, in the past, like 1 or 2 countries take the lead and they say, let's do it, and others will follow. Now it's different. But how to manage that and how to really develop, I think it's most important for WTO to reflect upon the situation and find new ways to move forward. I think that's the key for the future.
Well, but I don't think China is expected, and China should be filling the void here in case the United States is not there. What is your take on that?
First, I don't think China is willing already to do that kind of single-handed leadership. And on the other hand, I don't think the system needs such a kind of leadership from 1 or 2 or even 3 members. I think in the future it would need a lot of collective efforts by big and small and trying to do things more flexibly in the future to move things ahead. I think that's probably is one way out of it.
Multilateralism, definitely. There's no way, there's no one center of power anymore, and expecting either the U.S. or China is not the way that you're going to get anything accomplished. It's a world, exactly, and I agree with you, that where different bodies have to get together and there has to be a consensus. This is not a situation where it's a corporate mentality where you get 51% and you just bull your way through. And this is what Trump is counting on, except the U.S. is now not in the same position it was in 1991. We cannot just push things through because we are the largest entity. We are sharing the stage with many, many entities.
Right. Right. Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Professor Lu Shenquan, Associate Professor at the University of International Business and Economics of China, and Ina Tangen, author, columnist, and commentator. And here is my last point. In the joint statement that we discussed, Japan, the EU and the US agreed to enhance trilateral cooperation through the WTO and in other forums to eliminate so-called unfair market distorting and protectionist practices by third countries. Sounds like a very lofty goal, but let's not forget these 3 economies are precisely the 3 biggest economies with the highest level of agricultural subsidies, which is an important form of market distorting practice. Yes, China still needs to enhance its reforms, and China has pledged to go deeper and open wider on top of the over 1,000 measures it has already undertaken since it joined the WTO. But to gang up and attack with the insinuations will not create positive change. The WTO boat is already stalling, and these kinds of backhanded actions will not help. Remember, everybody is on board. That is all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook using the handle The Point with LX, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.